Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
Dr. Megan MacKenzie, welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for being willing to speak with us today. And before we get started, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself and where you're located, situated, and your scholarship.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm currently the Simons Chair in International Law and Human Security at Simon Fraser University, and I'm also the director of the School for International Studies.
Brilliant. So you came here to Queens to talk to us about your new book, Good Soldiers Don't Rape, the stories we tell about military sexual violence. So the first question that I want to ask you is, what is the origin story of this book?
Well, I mean, the true origin story of this book is that I really didn't want to write this book. I've been doing research on military culture and gender integration, and different issues related to women in the military for a very long time. And this is something that's always come up in my research, and I've always sort of left it to the side and thought someone else needs to write a book about this. I'm not the right person. It's such a complex issue. And so I really did not want to write this book. And then when I was at the University of Sydney, we had a visiting fellow, Selkie. I'm just forgetting her first name, but she had written a book called Writing Rape. Mm-hmm. And I just found it so fascinating. And it really captured basically how important conversations around sexual violence are historically. So she was focused on literature and, very different, but it really sparked an interest in me and sort of confirmed my gut feeling like that the way we were talking about military sexual violence was very important and required some kind of systematic analysis. So that book, I think it's called Reading Rape, made me kind of look more into the work on civilian sexual violence and what feminist scholars had written and how they had approached this issue, even if they weren't a medical expert or psychologist. And I realized there was a lot of potential to do a narrative analysis of this conversation. So I did sort of a proof of concept. I was living in Australia at the time, and with a couple of research assistants, we looked at a brief period in the Australian context just to see if it would actually make sense. And it was so telling to me that this was an important area that I really, I wrote a piece, we co-authored an article on the Australian context and then really expanded it almost immediately to a project.
So during this kind of proof of concept period, is that the moment in which you started developing some of the key concepts that you refer to in your book? So I know that one is rape culture, the other one is military exceptionalism, and the third one is
institutional gaslighting.
Institutional gaslighting. Did these concepts emerge while you were doing this experiment in Australia?
They emerged later.
Tell us more.
When I wrote my Band of Brothers book on the integration of women into combat roles, and I hope this is helpful for anyone who's working on their PhD or who's writing a book, the theoretical framework for that book came at the last minute. And it was sort of, I had an idea of what I wanted to say. And of course, some of the substantive chapters were taking shape, but I knew I had something to say theoretically that was not coming together. And I think that's a common experience when we're writing.
Absolutely.
And I wish more people would acknowledge that so that when people are writing, they don't worry if they don't know their framework from the beginning, and they can kind of trust that sometimes it's those last pieces that come together. And so, when I wrote the first article feature, I was really working with the concept of bad apples and exceptionalism, but it wasn't really, it was fine, but it wasn't really capturing what I wanted to do. And then it was really by revisiting Shireen Razak's work that I was like, okay, this is where I need to be. And then from then on, basically anything I'd read, I almost just fell out of relevance. And in sort of the theoretical chapter, is very indebted to her work and other Black feminist scholars.
It's kind of interesting you say that because I'm currently writing a book and my biggest stumbling block is the theoretical chapter.
Yeah.
Because I want to get it done first.
No.
And then write the rest.
No.
So thank you for that insight.
Wait till you're done and then like just let it percolate.
Yeah.
Just trust that it will come together.
Thanks. So, all right. So these concepts come as you're doing the work and almost near the end. There's one concept that I was particularly interested in, and that's the one of military exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're focusing mostly on the way news coverage talks about rape in the military. And as we know, and as you know, sexual violence is also prevalent in other militarized institutions in the Canadian context, but also elsewhere in Canada, the police, the RCMP, and the military. So these are militarized spaces. These are spaces where that are, as you mentioned, are highly respected by the population, but they are also the tools of settler colonial states or states more broadly to engage in legitimate violence, right? So this is kind of the classic definition of what the state is. And so I was particularly interested in thinking and to get your thoughts on whether you've also thought about the ways in which the state is somewhat complicit in the lack of accountability for gender-based violence broadly in society, and how that's related to institutions that are supposed to protect the state or state institutions, and how that state of exception that is linked to the state somewhat is reflected in those militarized institutions that are linked to the protection of the state. I don't know if the question makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I guess I think it's helpful just to say a little bit more about military exceptionalism. And yes, it's particular, right, specific in how it manifests in the military.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, it's not exclusive to the military. We have, institutions where violence is acceptable. Violence is one of the core mandates. So police, RCMP, I guess this is why I kept referring to Hockey Canada.
Mm-hmm.
This is also when we're thinking about major churches, where there's a certain kind of reverence for men, and a certain kind of reverence for men understood as doing something exceptional within that institution. So we have in the Catholic Church, men, the male priests who are sort of seen as taking a specific kind of oath and exceptional in their status vis-a-vis God. Hockey, when you have these sort of exceptional, young, talented athletes who are away from their parents in all kinds of exceptional circumstances. And then, of course, the military, there's different layers to it, but they're porous in how, and the logics at play are very similar. I will say that what comes through more in the book and then necessarily the talk today is how important whiteness is to that. Because if you think about what would happen, for example, if 5 Black men on a basketball team were accused of group sexual assault, and the consequences and the conversation around that versus what's happening in Hockey Canada, I think it would be very different.
Absolutely.
And so it very much is tied up, Shireen Razak would say, in the military institution represents sort of the state's ability to protect itself against the racialized other, right? And it's the stereotypical white male soldier That doesn't mean that all service members are white. It doesn't mean that all service members are male, but the ideal and the gendering of the institution is white and male, and is seen as sort of operating on behalf of the state. And that allows, that sort of legitimizes a certain level of dysfunction, on our behalf. And I guess that's where this logic of military sacrifice is sort of used sometimes to justify everything from war crimes to hazing. Those are just kids blowing off steam, they're bonding, and that's required. And so there's this, we as a public are also normalized to that. We're normalized it for hockey players too. We normalize hazing, we normalize young men being taken from their parents and, being, having a very different environment of socialization. And then that those logics extend into sort of acceptable dysfunction.
It's interesting that you're discussing the concept of whiteness in your book. And I know that a lot of your work experience, your research experience, has taken place in what we call settler colonial states, such as Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. Can you speak a little bit more about how that experience in those particular contexts? I know that each of these settler colonial states are different, but they are just that settler colonial states. How that framework, do you think influences the ways in which these institutions, those respective countries operate with regards to race, gender, and indigenous politics?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a common thread through all of them. As you said, they operate so different.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some very different internal politics. New Zealand, for example, is very different in the way it incorporates Maori service members, and even sort of at times can almost borrow or maybe take advantage of sort of the warrior ethos of the Maori, and it becomes revered, but in a very specific way. So I definitely think there's through lines, and certainly one of the through lines is how little space there is to critique the military, especially right now. I mean, it's been true since 9/11, I guess.
Yes.
But the space for civilians in particular to critique the military has closed out even more. And I think it's actually closing. I think as we approach the next election cycle, we'll see even less space. I think people feel like the burden that our safety as a nation depends on the defense forces doing their job. And most people have sort of a somewhat distant idea of what that job is. Many Canadians think our defense forces are doing a lot of peacekeeping and that we're still peacekeepers, which is out of touch. In the last decade, Australians have gotten very proud of their role in special forces. So that, it's all evolving, but it still reproduces those underlying logics of sort of maintaining settler colonialism, maintaining, protecting from an outside other.
These are all countries that have very distinct histories, but also different imagination about their militaries. I know that in the US, there's a particular narrative about respecting and honoring the troops, which is slightly different in Canada. Though it's a respected institution, there's definitely a different relationship between the ordinary citizen and the type of reverence that they have towards the military. And yet, as you talked about in your book, it's still a respected institution. How do you kind of make sense in your book of the differences in the way in which those institutions are revered, and yet the ways in which citizens think differently? You talked about peacekeeping in Canada. I know for a fact, having lived both in the US and Canada, that there seems to be, at least discursively, a lot more respect and admiration to the US troops. So I would assume that the Canadian public would be more critical or be more open to critique to the military as an institution. Why do you think, despite that difference in how people see the military, there's still the same reverence or at least respect in Canadian society?
Yeah, I mean, it's the most trusted public institution of all four of those case countries, and that hasn't changed over time. So I think it doesn't change in the midst of a war crime scandal. It doesn't change in the midst of sexual violence scandal. And I do think part of it is that the average citizen is very arm's length from the institution. And part of all of the national narratives has been around understanding military service is exceptional, something that most of us don't do. There is much more in the Canadian context an understanding of the professional nature of the Canadian Armed Forces. I think less than sort of the U.S. kind of combat ready, protecting the world kind of sense. But I think, Australia, it's evolved in something very interesting in the sense of they've shifted from a conception of peacekeepers to much more sort of these nimble special forces contributors. So I think it definitely evolved over time. And I don't know. I mean, I do think there's that distance. And I think partly there's been some great efforts at sort of conflating criticism with the military institution with saying soldiers are bad, and disrespecting their service. And I have to walk that all the time. I work with service members, and it's almost like I have to give a disclaimer that, my critique is not to say that every single service member is a bad because I think somehow that's become the narrative, like support the troops became don't criticize the troops. And that closed out all space where you can say, look, that is, it's not about an individual judgment on any one person. There still can be a discussion about institutional problems.
Thank you. I want to move on to the myths. So you talk about the myths in your book, and your previous book entitled The U.S. Military and the Myth That Women Can Fight. So you are definitely so good at deconstructing the ways in which we talk about institutions and practices. At the intersection of the myth that women can fight and good soldiers don't rape, what do you think is so important about deconstructing those stories with regards to the scholarship on women, gender, and security, and public conversations about institutions and gender inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I guess, how when you think about, like, what is my work really doing? And for me, my work is really about destabilizing myths that make war possible and legitimize war. And so that's it. That's what unites even my Sierra Leone stuff. I think, part of what legitimizes violence and ongoing violence in particular contexts can be myths around, women as only victims and sort of a very uncomplicated view of what war looks like and what the impacts of war are. And so for me, I think destabilizing the myths that uphold wartime logics and uphold militarized logics is one form of activism. It's my form of activism. I'm not, very good at other forms of activism, but I think when you can pull a thread apart, it's very helpful. And even the title of the book, Good Soldiers Don't Rape, it's uncomfortable. Like it starts an uncomfortable conversation around, well, some soldiers do rape. And what does that mean for the institution? And what does that mean about good soldiers? And what does it mean that this institution defined by discipline has had high rates of sexual violence for decades? What does it mean that basically nothing has been done that has helped to solve the problem? I think those are all really getting to the sore spot of how militarization reproduces itself. So I like just going straight in at that.
So just that last point you mentioned, which is you talk about in your book, is the ideal or perception on the one hand. There's kind of this paradox between the fact that soldiers or the military is believed to be an institution where they value they value discipline and order. At the same time, there's a narrative about the fact that we believe that in order to have, ready militaries, there's going to be some sort of violence and uncontrollable part of the soldier that we can't really help. Can you explain that a little bit more to our viewers who haven't read the book? Because I thought that was particularly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about almost any popular war movie, there's always the narrative of the good soldier, the good stoic soldier, who kind of comes undone at most, at some point in this story, right? That either sort of loses his cool or explodes, and that is actually an acceptable part of typically his identity, right? That there's always, in order to sort of foster this combat ready warrior, and I get asked this question all the time when I present my research. Well, if we're essentially training killers. So if you're doing that, if you want sort of an elite level, you have to expect some roughness, rough around the edges is often. And my argument is always like, if we are training someone to understand how to follow the rules of war and to use violence, we need the opposite. We need someone who is so disciplined that even in intense moments of, and I think, that's not to say that there aren't many service members who can do that. Obviously there are, because we see a lot of service members getting through very difficult deployments without sexual violence, without war crimes. So this narrative that a good soldier always has this untamability is kind of romantic, and I think is perpetuated in popular culture. And I think we certainly see it. So in Australia, their special forces are going through serious war crimes allegations. And part of that narrative around it is around how difficult it must be for special forces, how much pressure, and the special forces are so unique and their job, and that somehow helps explain these illegitimate forms of violence.
So that explains some of these forms of violence. How do we explain the impunity that is linked to that? Because it can explain mechanisms of behavior.
Yeah.
How do we explain the acceptance of the behavior in the institution or the lack of accountability?
Yeah, because I actually think institutions partly perpetuate that idea that's going to be a byproduct, that, sometimes new recruits are going to haze each other. That's just what they do to kind of get through the first year. And yes, officially it's not allowed, but, we kind of need to bond these guys. And so it becomes legitimized slowly by the institution and by the public. We sort of are like, wow, I don't know what it's like to do 2 tours in Iraq. So I don't know the circumstances. And I think the public does feel a sense of lack of ability to hold accountable. And I think that military exceptionalism logic, is accepted by the public. And so I think you see it in movies. So American Sniper is a great example. And, unless you're our age or older, it's not a movie many young people made. But I mean, Chris Kyle was a war criminal. And that movie was made to romanticize him. And it was I think it still is the top grossing or the most watched war movie of all time. So I think it's a great example of how we can come to romanticize and legitimize, criminality by service members and somehow embrace that as like heroic.
Yeah. So many kind of really important points that you're weaving together. And so I know, and I want to go back to your research and so I'm sorry, I'm switching gears because I want to make sure I don't forget. You also work specifically with women service members in the United States. So I know that you're wrapping up you've wrapped up the interview sessions and now eventually you'll work on this. But can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because it also offers us such an interesting perspective of your in-depth knowledge of the gender dynamics within the military in this context. I think it's mostly U.S. military.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this project? Because I'm assuming this is a forthcoming book.
Yeah, maybe. If I can survive, Yes, it's an awesome project that I'm doing. I have been doing with 2 US veterans. And basically we interviewed 22 of the first women to graduate from infantry roles when they were integrated in 2000. I mean, the policy changed in 2013. They were the first class graduated in 2016. And then they were interviewed every year for 5 years.
Well,
So interesting. And for me, one of the most interesting, I mean, first, just these women are incredible, and they helped to point out my own biases around who joins the Defense Forces, why do they join, what do they like, what are their perceptions of war and peace. Like, it completely helped me to really reduce my own bias and really see that people join the Defense Forces for all kinds of reasons, and these are just such exceptional women. One of the other things that was so interesting about that project is that these women really had the clear message that all of this fuss about combat roles, like, oh, women can't be in combat because it's so dangerous, it's so difficult, the training's so hard, and the job's so tough. And most of the women were like, it's not that hard. I mean, these are physically really exceptional women, and physical fitness requirements are designed for men. So sure, some of the shorter women had a hard time. One of the things they have to do at the combat fitness is take a heavy ball and throw it. So if you think about physics, if you're 6'4", your ability to throw a heavy ball is very different from a 5-foot tall woman. So anyway, women were still overcoming biases, but the thing that was interesting is they were like, it's not that hard. And I think that's a very big myth that's difficult to dispel, that actually the tip of the spear and this romanticism around combat units is so manufactured. It's not to say that combat units, when they're deployed, don't go under, but some other units, medics, I think probably has one of the most difficult jobs. And not that you would want to rank difficult jobs in a deployment, but just to say that, as Cynthia Enlow has written, combat units in the context of war are often the most protected, the most ready, the most well-trained. And so I think that's been really interesting. And also just, for a lot of these women, the Army is just not a great job for them. Like they just, some of them find it a very fulfilling job, and some of them really don't. And I think it's not about whether they can cut it or not. It's about whether it's the right thing for them. And so I think at least half of the 22 have, got out of the Defense Forces as soon as they could. And some of them are going to be career service members. But it's been a really amazing project. I just got a text the other day. One of them had a baby, and, developing relationships over time has been really interesting. Figuring out what to do with the data is a whole different thing, because these are very personal stories, especially for the women who are still serving. One of the things we did was we video recorded all of the interviews, and we will put them in the U.S. Army Women's Museum. So I know but, some of the women understandably have embargoed them, wait until they're at a different career stage. So there's all kinds of things that we didn't necessarily anticipate going in. But yeah, it's such an interesting project, even just to take women seriously, instead of to talk about women in the military, to talk to them and to hear their diverse stories. We had many first. I can't actually say some of the first because I'll out them, of course, but so many of the first in that cohort. And, they had a lot of challenges and a lot of amazing successes. So
I want to end on a methodological question. You've been in this space for decades. And so when you were doing your work in Sierra Leone, you're doing your work with this recent project you're talking about, and even this particular book reveals different approaches and methods. How has your method evolved? Is there an approach that you liked best? And what would you tell an early career researcher about the variety of approaches and methods you were able to use while still focusing overall on the same research question?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say to early career scholars is to think carefully about the question that is driving you and in your heart, and if the question for me, I guess, these questions about disciplinary debates and where my research fits in the discipline is just so not part of what I care about. And I encourage students, of course, we have to be, especially students who want a job as an academic. I'm not oblivious to the fact that we have to situate ourselves in some discipline to get a job. But that being said, I think the most interesting work is transdisciplinary in the true sense and is answering important questions, not sort of attempting to sort of add to some disciplinary debate. I mean, who cares? Who really cares about disciplinary debates? At the end of the day, it's just so irrelevant for me. And I think over time, if you center your analysis around your contribution to a disciplinary debate, it will just quickly become irrelevant because that's an evolving, hopefully, conversation. And if it's not, then you're probably in a very dull disciplinary debate. Yeah. So I'm, I can say that with luxury as a professor.
Yes.
in an interdisciplinary unit. So I recognize the privileges, but I just also encourage students to not be as beholden to them. I mean, for me, I think talking to people is always the most interesting. I chose a different approach for this book because I didn't want to put women in a vulnerable position. And I think there's something to, I was wanting to add to an existing debate about media coverage of civilian sexual violence. But I like talking to people and here, being challenged and sort of being open to having to shift your whole research plan because you don't hear what you thought you were going to hear. Yeah.
Megan, thank you so much. It's always lovely to speak with you and learn more about your work. And again, the title of your book, Good Soldiers Don't Rape, The Stories We Tell About Military Sexual Violence. And that is a Cambridge University press. So congratulations on your book.
Thanks
and thank you for coming.
Thanks.